So tonight is a very special night. We're really excited to partner with San Diego Girls in Tech, which is a national nonprofit organization with over 60,000 members and 50 chapters worldwide, dedicated to helping eliminate the gender gap in tech. And so we've been a partner with the San Diego chapter here for many years, and we put on similar workshops, similar events, and we're really excited to continue this partnership with tonight's talk. I haven't seen her pop in yet, but we're supposed to have Bijal Hopkins. She is the managing director of Girls in Tech. We also have Sarah, our speaker this evening. She's on the board of directors of Girls in Tech. So we have some great representation from this awesome community organization here in San Diego. And for those who are not familiar with Learn Academy, we are a 4-month intensive boot camp specializing in people launch a successful career transition into tech. We started in 2016. We were San Diego's first coding boot camp, and our headquarters is still here in San Diego, but we're now really proud that we can offer our program all across the United States with our virtual program. And so let's kind of dive right into tonight. I don't want to waste any more time. So we're here to learn a little bit more about what coding is, what this career path looks like. And just so everybody knows, I am going to be recording this presentation. We are going to send it out with some follow-up information along with the presentation link. So keep an eye out in your inbox for that before the end of the week. But to not waste any more time, I'm really excited to pass it off to our Director of Academic Experience here at Learn Academy, Sarah Proctor, who's going to be leading our presentation. Sarah, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Can everyone see the screen okay? Beautiful. Well, wonderful. I'm just really happy that you could all join us tonight. This evening, I want to talk a little bit about the question of coding. We often view learning and education as finding the answers to questions. And one of the most amazing things about technology that humans have created is that, relatively speaking, it's pretty easy to find the answer to questions that you have. But what happens when you don't even know what the question is? Because there's an art to asking a really good question. And I feel like the kind of catch-22 of it all is that you have to have some knowledge of a topic in order to be able to ask a really good question about that topic. So that's kind of my goal today, is I want us to all just walk away with enough base knowledge of what all of this coding stuff means so that everyone here feels more empowered to ask questions. So first of all, welcome to our virtual classroom. This is quite literally where I hang out all day. Since we are officially at our 2-year mark of a pandemic, I'm assuming that a lot of you are somewhat familiar with Zoom. You clearly made it here. But for the sake of being inclusive, I'll just briefly go over kind of how we use Zoom at Learn. For most of this session, I will be sharing my screen with you. You're welcome to manipulate the view for yourself to do whatever is most comfortable. And as TJ mentioned, if you're not currently speaking, I would just ask that you mute yourself to avoid background noise and interference. But please feel free to unmute and talk at any time. I love questions. I don't believe that interruptions are a thing. I think we're all here to have a conversation together. So if you have a question or a comment, unmute and go for it. I also really appreciate being able to see people. I don't like the feeling of just talking to myself, staring at my computer. So please turn on your camera. It does not bother me if you have a messy room. I don't care if you're eating, if you have people or animals that come and visit. I love it all because we know that life happens. And I think that sharing these experiences kind of helps us connect because we're in a virtual setting, but we still want to have human interactions. And I think by sharing that experience of just being open to the little box on your screen, exposing your life, helps us create those interactions. And I have spent over 8 hours a day in a meeting exactly like this on Zoom for the last 2 years. So I have had many students over that time, and I have seen it all. So there's nothing that you're going to do that's going to bother me. Let's just agree that Zoom meeting stays out of the bathroom. So just briefly, I want to discuss our code of conduct at Learn. This is a public Zoom link, and I want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence to keep our meetup space and our classroom space protected and keep it a positive experience for all of you. At Learn, we strive to create an inclusive and brave space. And a brave space is a philosophy where everyone is allowed and encouraged to express ideas and learn from each other. And the idea of a brave space, we get to come together with all of our uniquenesses and all of our individual experiences. And in turn, we get to take all those experiences and put them together and create a thing that's greater than the sum of its parts. And so a brave space means that we get to challenge each other in a way that creates growth, but never to disparage or cause harm. Your words and your actions have impact on others. So if on the extremely rare off chance that there's ever a participant in any of our meetups or any of our classroom experiences that violates our inclusive and brave space, we're going to remove that person from the meeting and follow up if necessary. I just want to put that out there because I think it's important for us to all feel comfortable here. I just want to be able to talk to all of you and learn some cool stuff and hopefully have a little bit of fun. All right, well, since this is our virtual classroom, this is exactly what it looks like to me every day at work. I want to ask you to participate in the kind of a ritual that we have by in how we start our classroom every day. We start by just answering some kind of fun sort of icebreaker question. So please go ahead and unmute. If there's interruptions, it's okay. We can just work through that, but answer one or all of the following questions.
All right, so I prefer coffee over tea.
All right. Anybody else want to introduce yourself and answer a question, any or all?
This is Ian. I love Star Wars series.
Okay, I'll go ahead. My name is Jorge. I'm in Menifee, California. It's about an hour and a half north of San Diego. Definitely coffee drinker. I love coffee every morning. I have to have it. Something on here, TV series. Quick funny story. I'm 45 years old. When I was young, I remember turning TV on and watching cartoons or whatever. And I hear this, I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, MASH. They show MASH about Korean War. The music would come on, and as a kid, I would turn it off. I couldn't stand it. And funny thing, about a month ago, my wife and I started watching it. I'm in season 2, and I love MASH now at this age. So very, very good show. Oh, you got to be a little older, I think, to appreciate it.
Love it.
Hi, I'll say hi. My name is Jerry, and right now I'm a photographer. And the TV series that I'm into right now, because my family and I watch shows a lot. And the newest one we fell in love with was What We Do in the Shadows TV show. I highly recommend it. And coffee all the way.
I'm currently not employed. I'm a Learn student full-time right now. And my favorite movie or series right now would be Encanto. I like coffee a lot. And the fourth one, I technically have that already. I have a dog. He looks like a polar bear. So yeah, I have a tiny polar bear running around my house.
I love it.
I'm Jade. I prefer coffee and tea, whatever source of caffeine I can get, really. And then TV series I like is King of the Hill. It's just classic, and I grew up watching it.
Oh my gosh, I haven't revisited that in a while. That's a good idea. Wonderful. Well, feel free to add your comments in the chat. I am currently the director of academic experience at Learn. I live in San Diego, where Learn is headquartered. I started watching The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. It's on Amazon, and it is so funny. I am currently obsessed with that show. I think I would, if I could have a pet, I think I would have a tiny giraffe. I just like the idea of something like a giraffe, but like kind of just tiny, sort of spindly, walking over my apartment. I think that would be great. All right. Well, quickly, as I mentioned, this is me. I am an instructor at Learn, and Learn is a web development bootcamp, and it was San Diego. Well, it was all of Southern California's first bootcamp. Learn is a full-time immersive program, and we specialize in career transitioners, so people who are not developers who want to become developers. And we teach full stack development, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means here shortly. But I am also a career transitioner. I come from a non-technical background. I studied psychology and I worked in restaurants for a really long time. I worked at this great little French restaurant in San Diego for many years, but ultimately the thing about restaurants is you can make good money, but at some point you just run out of new things to learn. And I swear I did my due diligence. I managed the bar, I did product ordering, inventory and cost projections, created cocktail menus, which was of course very fun. But eventually I just ran out of things to do, and it just became mind-numbingly dull. And when I ran out of new things to learn, I just started to realize that there was a lot of systemic problems in the industry that nobody really wanted to solve. And so it just drove me crazy trying to solve problems and have people be like, yeah, that's just how it is. And so I was like, I just can't do it anymore. I got to figure out the next step. And I didn't really know what that next step was going to be, but I knew that I needed a passion. I knew I needed something that I could be proud of. And so I literally sat down and I made a list and just thought about, what do I want my day to look like? And what would make me feel good? And what would keep my interest and let me keep learning? And where could I solve problems and create systems that people are excited to take on rather than experiencing that resistance? And so ultimately I came up with programming. And a few months later, I found myself as a student at Learn Academy. And that was in 2018. And I will tell you that is absolutely the best thing that I've ever done. And now I'm here. And one of our missions at Learn is to help build the tech community in San Diego. So hosting meetups like this is one of the ways that we offer our knowledge to anybody who's interested. We like to be an active presence in the tech community. So a lot of the Learn staff are involved in various local meetup groups. I'm on the leadership team at Girls in Tech in the San Diego chapter. And as CJ mentioned, Girls in Tech is a global nonprofit. They work in like 30 different countries. They have chapters all over the world, and ultimately looking at, lessening that gender gap in tech. And in the San Diego chapter, we really like to support people that are making that transition into tech. And we like to celebrate the unique backgrounds and skill sets that career transitioners bring to the tech industry. And I can attest, as a career transitioner, it's really easy to fall prey to imposter syndrome. And so at Girls at Tech, we want to support each other during these times and help normalize that struggle. It helps us all feel a little bit less isolated. So I'm really happy that they could co-host with us this evening. And I'm happy to be a part of just so many wonderful communities that help give voice to people who are trying to do stuff with their lives, trying to make their lives better, and working through that challenge to become a better version of yourself. So this particular meetup came into existence first about 3.5 years ago. And the world of development can feel really intimidating. Again, when you're transitioning careers, there's just this unknown that's really like the scary part of the process. And I really wanted to do a meetup that just talks plainly about what being a developer is in a way that's really approachable. I don't want to make assumptions of knowledge. I don't want to scare people away who are feeling intimidated or unsure about what coding is, because I was definitely that person. And so the joke was that we were all sitting together in a Learn staff meeting, and I was trying to sort of bumbling my way through of trying to explain what my goal is here. I was like, I just want to talk about it, but not in a weird way. I just wanted to be very plain spoken. And my boss, Rob Kaufman, was just like, oh, so you just want to explain what the F coding is? I was like, yes, that's exactly it. So it was kind of a joke, but the name stuck. And basically that's my goal for tonight, is just to like talk about this in a very approachable way. My underlying like thing I think in my head is like, how would I explain this to my mom? And not to diss my mom, she's very smart and she's actually very tech savvy, but I just think of like lowering that bar of not making the assumptions, and let's just look at this from the 10,000-foot view of coding so that we can all feel like we have a little more knowledge in order to go about asking good questions. And one of the reasons I really like this meetup is because as I mentioned, I came from a non-technical background. I was absolutely the person who had no idea what they were getting into going into this process. And I was the ultimate career transitioner, having very little skill sets in the way of programming. But I truly believe that if I can do it, that you can do it. It's hard. It's really, really hard. I would definitely never sugarcoat how difficult it is to go through this process. But it's all doable through working out your problems and doing it over and over again. It's the same idea as becoming, going to the gym and lifting weights. You don't get fit by lifting the weights one time. You have to just do it over and over again. And so we practice this idea at Learn, and really programmers of all kinds practice this idea called rubber ducking, which is why we had the rubber duck on the previous slide. But there's this idea that if you can talk out your problem, it can help you reframe the question and find holes in your logic. So rubber ducking is one of the many ways that we work through problems. So if you ever heard that phrase, that's where it comes from. But coding is hard and absolutely doable. And I want to make sure that I'm doing my part to lower the barrier of entrance, because technology needs all of you. Technology needs diversity in every way possible. It needs input from all the people who use it, which is everybody. And there was a point in the relatively recent past when technology was made by and used by a very small group of people. And the people making technology were very, very smart, predominantly younger white males. And we can look back at that time and thank them for their contribution. We would not be here without those amazingly smart people. But technology is just too big now. You can't be exclusionary in that way. And so as a society, we need to open this field to everyone. It's too important not to. Because whether you understand coding or not, it is in your everyday life. It's in your car. It's in medical devices. It's in credit cards. It's in almost every source of entertainment that you have. And then of course in your phones and the apps that keep us all functioning in the world. I mean, for everyone to work, to exist in this world, if you're going to apply for a job, if you're going to open a bank account, if you're going to rent an apartment, I mean, even buying household goods or traveling means interaction with technology. So it's not a luxury item anymore. It's critical to the function of our everyday lives. And so the idea that technology should be made by and represented by the people who use it is incredibly important to me, and it's incredibly important to us at Learn. So let's talk a little bit more about what the F that means. So when we talk about coding, one of the first things that I found was that people would always ask me, like, what does that mean? Like, when I said I was going to learn how to code, a lot of people thought I was learning like medical coding. A lot of people were asking me if I was like building computers, and really it's not any of those things. But the scope of the term developer is very broad. But generally, when we talk about developers, what we're meaning is that we're creating software. And it's sometimes you can hear it being referred to as being like a dev or a software developer or a software engineer. But the through line of all of that is that as a developer, you are using languages written by other people and creating new things from those languages. So the term software developer is very broad. But at Learn, we focus mostly on web development, meaning the software that we're writing and the content that we're creating can be accessed via the internet. So we're creating web applications. And generally, the distinguishing line between a web application and a web page is, does the user log in? Does the service save information about me, the user, and allow me to then create content? So if I go to a website of a restaurant, I can see their menu, I can see their location, I can see information about the business, but that to me is a web page. But if I go to something like Zoom, I can create an account, I can schedule meetings, and all of that information is stored by Zoom. And so that is a web application. And mobile applications are basically the same concept with a slight difference in the tools that are used and the way that the information is accessed, meaning that rather than going to a web browser, you would go to an app store. But the fundamentals are all the same. And so learning to build a web page, something like the restaurant example, is super cool and super useful. Every business needs a web page of some kind in order to display information. But when we talk really about being a web developer and what we do at Learn, we're talking about building web applications, things that allow your user to create and store data. So why learn programming? In the early days of my class at Learn, when I was a student, we were asked, why are you here? And this is kind of an aggregated list of what came up. And I really like this list. And so I just wanted to share it with you. It is challenging. You will never, ever know everything about development. It just isn't possible. I have people that I've worked with who have been programming for 25 years and they don't know it all. And they will be the first to tell you that you won't either. And that can feel really overwhelming at first, but it's also kind of freeing because you can't know it all. It's impossible. And so you don't have to. You can just lift that weight off of your back. But if you can look at it as an advantage, you always get to learn more. You will never run out of things to learn. There is no right answer in coding. If it works, that's the right answer. There's better ways than others, but generally speaking, coding doesn't work in this black and white term of right or wrong answers. And I really like that. I like the creative aspect of being able to solve a problem where there is no right answer. You're just figuring out the way through. It is very cool to learn a skill that is very relevant. In my background studying social sciences, it was always about theory and history and trends, but coding is this tangible skill. It's a thing you get to create and see outcomes, and you can apply it to many different industries, which I think is really neat. I see a lot of people that are drawn to code who come from kind of artistic backgrounds, and that people that just are the type of people who need to create things, that they have ideas in their head that they just want to be able to make real. And coding and learning software allows you to do that. You get to express yourself through creation. One of my personal faves. You have to have a very organized mind to be a successful developer. Your code base and your file structure can be huge. There's so much that requires detail-oriented organization. But if you like that kind of thing, it is wonderful. Even though coding languages often use English words, everyone across the world uses the same coding languages. And so it's very common for a company to have teams on either side of the globe in order to have teams working 24 hours a day in their own time zone. And the communication happens through the coding language because developers work with coworkers that don't often speak their same language, but you get to communicate through your code, which I love the cohesiveness of that. Another one that's huge right now is that developers are needed everywhere, and we need developers right now. There are jobs available all over the place. it's challenging because development is hard and you have to be ready for that challenge. But there are teams working everywhere in the world and working remotely, and there is a huge demand in this industry. And then the last one is just that it's really artistic. You can make beautiful things with your code. There's a lot of digital mediums that are really amazing, but the code itself can be beautiful. The code, like the creation of code that just works really well, can be beautiful. And so I think that's a fun way to look at your code, not only the thing that you create, but the actual creation of it as well. Another big one that I think is important is that we use technology every single day. Again, we can't function without it. But not many people really know how all that stuff works. And so learning to code and learning some software development fundamentals allows you to kind of peek behind the curtain. And it will absolutely make you appreciate the technology that we have available to us and recognize what a challenge that is for this thing to be created. All right, let's talk a little about programming languages. So programming languages, just like any other language, developers use languages that already exist to create new things. In the exact same way that we use the English language with established vocabulary and grammar to express our own ideas by creating new and unique combinations. And so programming languages have that same structure. They have vocabulary. They have certain keywords that are built into the language. They have a sentence structure. You have pieces that need to be in a particular order. They have punctuation, which in code we call syntax, that creates the ability for our code to effectively communicate. Because the number one goal of code is communication. One, we have to communicate to our computer the actions that you want to perform. Computers are inflexible machines. They are really good at doing one thing over and over and over again. Computers are not good at nuance or implications or, kind of just getting the gist of the thing that you meant. And so you have to be very specific in your communication. And the second and kind of more important aspect of communication is that as a developer, you have to communicate what your code is doing to other developers and to future you. Because I will tell you, no one is a worse developer than you 6 months ago. It's the equivalent of like if you've ever just like scribbled a note to yourself on a scratch paper and then later you think back and you're like, what? Why did I write down watermelon balloon? And you're like, no. Same thing happens to developers all the time. You can write code that looks fantastic in the moment, but if you don't know what it says and no one else knows what it says, no one's going to spend the time fixing it when it invariably needs updates. So it doesn't matter if you can write beautiful working code. If it's not communicating intent, it's not going to last very long. So in the broadest, most oversimplified terms, web development can be broken down into two main components, the front end and the back end. The front end, sometimes referred to as client-side development, is basically all the stuff that you see when you go on the internet. It's all of the stuff you interact with on a web application. And the front end consists of both UI, which stands for user interface, and UX, which stands for user experience. And UI is all of the visual aspect of the page. Is the app nice to look at? Is it pleasing to the eye? Is it on brand for the business? So I think of the UI as kind of the art major of development. The UX is the ease and flow with which the user can navigate and use the application. So is the app intuitive? Can the user easily get to the desired results? Is the user able to access the feature that you've created? And so I think of the UX as kind of the sociology major of development. A couple, well, years ago now, the Lyft app, is as it has grown in its complexity. I remember that they like added this feature years ago where you could actually like see the cars, driving around on the app. And that was like a new feature at one point, many, many years ago. And it was super cool because you could kind of like watch it and you're tracking all of the stuff. And it was great. But there was kind of a problem in that when you saw that page, it was very visually stimulating, but you still had to, like, as a user, continue to click buttons in order to actually secure your ride. And I didn't realize this until one day I taught my parents how to use Lyft. And they were visiting me in San Diego, and then they went home and they were like, oh, we're going to get ourselves home from the airport. We're going to order a Lyft. And they're super proud. And so they're like standing outside the airport and they're watching the cars drive around on the app. And no one's stopping and they can't figure it out. And so they call me and they're just like, this app is broken. I was like, oh, okay. I found it a very hilarious moment of like old person syndrome, but actually it's kind of problematic for Lyft because that next button click that they hadn't done defines whether you are a customer or not. And so that button is making Lyft money or not. And that the baby boomer generation is a huge market for rideshare companies. And so creating good user experiences where you can easily navigate the application, the UX of the application is super important. And it also takes us back to this idea of inclusion in technology and why it is important for everyone with all of your different backgrounds and experiences to be contributing to the creation of technology. So there's lots and lots of front-end technologies, things that create visual feedback. But there are three technologies that pretty much every web page in existence has. And that's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They're kind of the main building blocks for development. And those are the languages they're going to talk a little bit more about shortly. But before we do that, we'll talk about the other side, the backend. So the second main component is the backend, or it's often referred to as server-side development. And it is all the code kind of under the hood. So it's the code that allows the web applications to save your information and then to pull your information back when you want to see it. And so the backend is content storage and data structures. So I kind of think of it as like the engineering major of development.
Would the backend be like a cloud then, since it's storing all the information?
Absolutely. There's a lot of cloud-based development that's happening for content storage, for sure. And just like the front end, there's many, many languages that can be used for that. There's many, many technologies that can be used to support the backend development. At Learn, we teach Ruby on Rails, which is a framework written in the Ruby programming languages. But Python is a really, really popular data science language. Node.js is another one that's really popular. PHP, Java, .NET, all of those are popular backend technologies. But of course, just scratching the surface, there are many, many ways to create these technologies. But interestingly, there is actually a language called Java, and we just talked briefly about JavaScript. And interestingly, those are actually two very unique things that have not a whole lot in common. But back in 1995, the guy who created JavaScript actually purposely named it that way, kind of in hope of confusing his new thing that he was creating with Java, that was a very established language at that time. And spoiler alert, it totally worked. So backend development is code that receives requests from the front end and then sends back information. And so to kind of understand a little bit more about what's happening there, let's talk about the internet. So again, this is like everything we're doing here, very, very oversimplified. People spend their careers on things that I'm sort of just not even mentioning in my gloss over. But basically the internet is the largest machine on Earth. I like to create the analogy of like, there's a quaking aspen colony in, I think in southern Utah. And scientists realized that it was actually all connected. They all shared the same DNA. It was one organism that had an interconnected root system. And just the trees popping up looked like individual trees, but they weren't. They were all based in one entity. And so I kind of think of that as like how the internet is, that we're all like, all of this is just a series of tubes that connect our computers all over the world. And when those connections are happening, we're connecting all of our computers, but we're also connecting computers whose job it is to store information. And those computers are called servers. And there are servers all over the world. A server is really just a computer with all of the user parts stripped away. And so as a developer, you can use your personal computer to act as a server while you're working in your code and development. And eventually, we take that content and ask another service to store that content on their server. And there's tons and tons of servers all over the world. Amazon actually owns a whole bunch of them. There's a lot of the internet that is actually hosted from Amazon servers. But basically what that is just a warehouse, probably in somewhere where land is cheap, in a location that's probably a little bit of a cooler climate, and it just has a bunch of computers, and it's just storing information. And so when a website is hosted, meaning it can be found on the internet through a URL, that content that it is connected to is stored on a server. And you as the user of the internet can make requests, get that information, and the request is going to travel along all of these internet tubes back and forth between your computer and wherever that information is being stored anywhere in the world.
I have a quick question for you all. So
Sure.
in regards to, because software developer is pretty much, we used to talk about the back end where you have the server side. How does that correlate with cybersecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. Cybersecurity is making sure that these requests and responses are going to the people they are supposed to go to and not to people they are not supposed to go to. It's protecting that process, that loop from getting it in the hands of someone who shouldn't have access to it.
So they work hand in hand.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I've had a lot of my students pursue cybersecurity once they're out of the boot camp and into the industry. The fundamentals all come from the same place. But cybersecurity is just a very like niche, subset of development at large.
Thank you.
Yeah, and cybersecurity is super important. I think, we all hear about the like leaks and hacks and all of that stuff that happen all the time, and we definitely need people in cybersecurity. I like this picture because it's not just the internet, but it's all of the fiber optic cables that run along the ocean floor, which I think is kind of cool. It's just really amazing to me to sort of like recognize that this is how we exchange information. And plus, I really like this little robot guy whose job it is to lay the cables on the ocean floor. And so this isn't super pertinent to the topic, but every time that I look at or think about like the internet cables, I just imagine this little guy, doing his job at the bottom of the ocean. And I just really want him to like have googly eyes and a, mustache or something. But really, when it comes down to it, when we're talking about, where the servers live compared to where your computer lives, it all comes down to speed. Every time you hit enter on a URL, there's a lot going on, and it happens really, really quickly. In fact, it needs to happen in fractions of a second, because if it doesn't, your users will leave you. we just talked about cybersecurity, but there's sort of this idea of like the unsexy pillars of development. One is security, another is accessibility, and then speed, making sure things are super, super optimized is the third pillar of unsexy pillar of development. But they're all immensely important. And speed particularly because I don't know about you, but I'm an impatient user of the internet. If a page isn't loading, I'll just leave and do something, go to a different website. People will notice if a page takes longer than 1 second to load. And statistically, more than half of your users will not wait 3 seconds. And so when we're talking about connecting all of our computers and looking at this, all of these cables that run around the world, all of this happens, all of these requests and responses happen in seconds, which I just think it's nice to just recognize that. So kind of along the short of the internet from a developer's point of view is this series of requests and response. Every time you interact with the internet and you see a different page load, there's a new request and response cycle that's happening. And development and data flow is creating successful request and response cycles. So requests and responses follow HTTP, which is short for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And basically what that is a collection of agreed upon rules that make this cycle consistent and successful. And so I think it's worth just briefly touching on kind of the four main parts of the protocol, which are broken down into 2 on the request and 2 on the response. So starting with the request. So this happens when you hit enter on a URL. Every URL, which it stands for a Uniform Resource Locator, they all correspond to an IP address. And an IP address is the physical location of that server. Wherever that thing is in the world, it has a number assigned to it, like an address. The URL is just the human readable version of that. So we reference Google, but the IP address is going to be like 08.08.08 or something like that. And that's how the computer interacts with information. And the communication between those 2 things is part of the whole idea that development is based on communication. So the URL corresponds to an IP address that gives us the location of where we are going with this request. And I mentioned briefly that often developers will use their own personal computers to act as a server while you're in development, while you're creating your application. And so another way of saying that is that you're working on your local or your home server. And the IP address that corresponds to your own personal computer is always 127.0.0.1. So that is your home IP address. So the second part that we need to make successful requests is an action. So we know where we're going, but we also need to know what we're doing when we get there. There's different types of actions that a user can do, and they're grouped into kind of 4 main categories. And this grouping gives developers a set of vocabulary words that encompass common ways that data is managed on a web application. So generally speaking, your user would want to see or read content. You can also create new content. You can update existing content or delete content. And so these create, read, update, and delete form a delightful acronym, CRUD. So it is the goal of a web developer, of a full stack web developer, to create CRUD on their application. So we got to know what we're going to do and where we're going to go. But once that happens, we are at the server and we're ready to come back with information. So response. Part of the response is a response code. And these are tools that developers use to provide information about the success or not of this cycle. Every request gets a response. If you hit enter on a URL, you will eventually get a response no matter what. But sometimes those responses are successes and sometimes things go wrong. And so by giving the different possible outcomes a specific code, developers can then have their application respond accordingly. So if the code says, cool, we're all good, you go ahead and load the page. Go ahead and load the data. Your user is going to see what they want to see or create what they want to create. But if something goes wrong, we should respond. Let's not just leave the user there with a blank page. We need to give them some way to fix whatever the problem is. And so making sure that the application still works, even if there's an error, is called coding for the unhappy path. And it's a really important part of the user experience, of that interaction with the user, that often gets overlooked. And you've probably seen this, because I'm sure that you have all been on web pages and you've seen a 404. That is a response code for information not found. It's sort of a generic catch-all for something about the request went wrong. And if that happens, and it happens all the time because mistakes happen, developers can create pages in their code that will display cute error messages or give instructions to the user on how to fix the problem. And the last part of our cycle is the payload. So the payload of this request response cycle, which follows HTTP or Hypertext Transfer Protocol, the payload is Hypertext Markup Language, or HTML. And HTML is the foundation of the internet. Everything that you see on a web page or in a mobile app is wrapped up and delivered inside of HTML. And often this payload can be huge. We use applications all the time that have an immense amount of data that travels in these requests and responses. And so in order for the payload to travel quickly as possible, and remember the 3-second rule, all of this has to happen within about 3 seconds. The response may be divided up into individual pieces, but it's all going to get reassembled like the kid from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and display the page successfully when it gets back. And all of the stuff that we talked about and so much more happens in no more than a couple of seconds, which is really amazing. So HTML, Hypertext Markup Language, is the words on the page. That's what comes back from all of this stuff. It creates what we see when we look at the internet. I like to think of it as like the skeleton that holds up our web page. Or if we go back to the language analogy, where everything that we're creating in code is analogous to spoken language, we can think of HTML as being kind of the nouns of our language. And HTML really came about in conjunction with HTTP. The HT in both of those acronyms, which is hypertext, is ultimately interconnected. In 1989, a very smart human named Tim Berners-Lee, he was working as a physicist at CERN, and he and his team developed this idea of being able to share documents via hypertext. And so his idea was to introduce a system that would sort of unify and standardize the internet. Prior to this, it was kind of a Wild West. People could send information to each other, but it kind of depended on what system you were working on. There was no thing that everybody could adopt that would make it sort of uniform. And so his team came up with this crazy idea called the World Wide Web. And HTML was the first language that would work on all computers and all systems as long as you were connected to the internet. And the widespread application of HTML and HTTP was the ability to access information. And this was particularly powerful for people in education settings and the military, because prior to that, if I had a document in California and I needed to send it to you in Texas, I would have to put a stamp on it, put it in the mail, and send it to you. And there's an obvious limitations to that. Think of the poor reference librarians at the universities who are mailing books to people and having to track where all of that stuff was going. So clearly the idea that documents could be shared online for anybody who had access to the internet was immensely appealing. And so as HTML was being adopted and put into place, really the first application was to be able to send text documents, things that sort of like modeled after like a periodical or a report of some kind. And so the HTML that we still use today has this same base structure. And so when we look at HTML, we have things that identify headings and paragraphs and list items, which are all things that you would associate with formatting for a text-based document. So when we're talking about HTML, really what we're talking about is tags. A tag is a basic unit of HTML, and a tag gives the computer information on how to display the content. So tags are read by the computer and have a set of, or an opening tag and a closing tag that together create a set of information. Everything in the middle of the tag is what we see on the screen. The computer interprets how to display that content. So the next language that pretty much all developers will come across is CSS. And CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It is the code that makes your page look good. Without CSS, every page looks like it fell out of the 1990s. So if anyone here is old enough to remember MySpace, if you were making your MySpace page look fantastic, you were probably using a lot of CSS. So we can think of that as, in our language analogy, as the adjectives of our language. Adjectives need something to describe, and CSS needs HTML in order to create stylings. So CSS targets HTML tags and applies modifiers to them. So with HTML and CSS, we have stuff on the page and the stuff on the page that looks pretty. I wanted to just take a second and look at a page without CSS. So pages nowadays are very dependent on styling in order to create the user interface, in order to create the visual pleasantness of a page. But I have a little browser extension that will allow me to remove the styles. And it is funny to look at. I mean, ignore the giant picture here, but what you can see is that what you have is just basic formatted text with some bullet points. And as I scroll down, I get just a series of paragraphs that is challenging to see, but headers and paragraph tags. Let's look at learns. So removing all of the styling, we still have a picture, but our entire header just turns into list items. They're just a series of bulleted lists. And so you can see the difference in how styles affect your code. The modification of HTML tags can create this beautiful hover effect menu, where if I remove it, it's just a series of bullet points. And these bullet points are the raw HTML. All right, so JavaScript is kind of the third of our big three. JavaScript is the power language. HTML and CSS are the foundation of everything we see on the web, but they don't typically do a lot of interaction. They create things that we can look at, which is great, but limiting. JavaScript is a different category of language. It allows a developer to perform logic, meaning that we can empower the application to interact with users depending on how the user applies data. And so if you click a button and you see a response, you are looking at JavaScript. In order to see JavaScript on the page, we still ultimately need HTML and CSS. We can't see our JavaScript so much as we can see the interaction that's being created. JavaScript allows us to manipulate data. And so we can store information and ask our computer to run mini programs that evaluate that information and then perform an action based on the outcome. And because JavaScript manipulates data, it's very particular about how it processes that data. So JavaScript has categories of information that it will work with, and these are called data types. And there's roughly 7 data types, but we won't nitpick about the specific breakdowns of those. Some of the base ones that if you're interested in pursuing web development, you should be familiar with are string, number, and Boolean values. Strings are just characters that are stored inside of quotation marks. And strings have particular properties. They have a length property. You have the ability to identify the location of characters inside of strings. Numbers are exactly what you think they are. The number data type allows you to perform mathematical functions and compare values. Boolean values are the value of true or false. So they can be used for logical comparisons. For example, if 6 is greater than 3, that would return a Boolean value, true or false. And just kind of an interesting tidbit, I just think this is really fascinating, but the Boolean name, it is actually named after a mathematician, George Boole. George Boole wrote a book called The Mathematical Analytics of Logic back in 1847. And he was a self-taught mathematician, philosopher, and logician. And he basically, his idea was to distill all the mathematical expressions that he was working with in algebra down into true or false values. And then he could perform logical evaluations with these. And so the idea of true or false values maps basically directly to the concept of an electrical circuit being on or off, which represented often in computer science by a 0 or a 1. And that's really the fundamentals, the basics of electronics and computer sciences is the series of logic gates that open and close. And all of this was sort of mathematically theorized by someone in the 1800s that had no practical application in his lifetime. He was completely unappreciated for his kind of bizarre branch of math, but yet it is absolutely what we used in order to create modern computer science. So I just think that that's really cool. Okay. So once we have data types in JavaScript, we can store information by creating variables. And just like in math class, you can have a value of X. You can say X equals 6. And anytime you reference X, really what you're referencing is the value that it currently holds. And developers do the exact same thing. We create variables that store data. We create abstraction by being able to reference the variable rather than the data directly. All right. I want to look at one more thing here. Let's get this back on. There we go. So I want to talk about something that I use all the time that's super cool. If you're interested in pursuing more development, this is a really great place to start. It's just looking at the developer tools in the Chrome console. There's lots of different browsers that have development tools, but we typically use Chrome's. They're pretty great. But basically, I can look at the source code of whatever website I'm looking at. So if I right click or control click on any web page in Chrome, I have a little pop-up menu that gives me the option to inspect. And clicking this opens a menu that shows me the markup of what is on the page. So remember that all of the basis of everything we see is HTML. And one unit of HTML is a tag. And so even though there's kind of a lot of noise here, what we're looking at is a series of tags. This is a cool way to just kind of start to explore the complexities of a web page. And again, you can look at any page in this way. Down at the bottom here, we have the CSS that is applied to those tags. So if I want to look at this header tag, or that's creating the navigation menu, I can see what styles are applied. Which is pretty great. Another thing I really like about the Chrome browser is Chrome is actually built on a JavaScript engine. So it's called a V8 engine, and it's just an open source technology that was actually written in another coding language. So even coding languages have been created through other coding languages. But this JavaScript engine allows us to basically have a place that you can play around with JavaScript code. If you want to just create some variables, interact with some data types, you can do that without doing anything else by just inspecting your browser and clicking over to the console. So as we mentioned, we've got data types of strings, we've got data types of numbers, and we can create comparisons that will return Boolean values. Kind of a fun thing to play around. And this was actually kind of interesting. I was trying to show my class something, and I was looking for an error, and I stumbled across this just completely randomly, but I went onto Codecademy's website, which if you want to, they have wonderful free classes if you want to ever check those out. But I was inspecting the page, and I clicked over to this console tab where you can run JavaScript. And what we have here is a little recruitment tool, which I thought was very clever, because if you've made it here, it's very possible that you are interacting with the code base in some way. And so I thought that that was really cool. So developer tools most browsers have some tools, but Chrome definitely has them laid out in a very clear way. You can see that by right-clicking or control-clicking and selecting inspect. And it's a really fun way to just become a little more familiar with what is out there completely for free. But at the end of the day, being a developer is all about being a really good learner. Your job is going to be problem solving, and you aren't going to know how to do it. Your job is to figure it out. And so I like to just have these, 10,000 foot overviews, of course, incredibly simplified, but just kind of covering the important pieces to understand about the industry, and having a baseline context about coding and development, and just a little bit about different languages that you're going to see and interact with as a user of the internet is really important when you go forth and want to ask more questions, because the answers are all out there, but you just have to find the right question. So if you liked this, we do additional classes. We've got one called Jumpstart, which is a 3-day workshop. Our next one is in April, and we dive into the languages that I covered just ever so briefly tonight. We talk about HTML, we talk more about CSS and about JavaScript, and create a little code game. But I think TJ will probably share some more information there. But otherwise, There's some resources that I used and I like to play around with when I'm discovering new questions. Please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. I'm available to just hang out and chat. I don't have anything going on. So if you just have questions you want to talk about or explore any concepts in a little more depth, I'm very down for that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate
Yeah, thank you.
appreciate your time.